The bank feeds option was introduced in Sage Accounts version 22. It's a great enhancement to the bank reconciliation option and speeds up the process. It basically enables you to download your transactions from your bank account into Sage Accounts and then automatically match them against the transactions that you've entered. Let's have a look at how it works in the software. There is a sign-up process involved, however, we're not going to cover that in this demonstration. Instead, we're going to concentrate on the bank feeds process and how it works. In bank accounts, we've already got account 1200 set up with a bank feed. So with it selected, we click bank feeds. The bank feeds window is split into 4 boxes. The 2 boxes on the left refer to the transactions downloaded from your bank, and the 2 boxes on the right refer to the transactions in Sage. At this stage, you can see the transactions that we've already entered into Sage that haven't yet been reconciled. They're in the top box. And we want to download the bank transactions. So from the toolbar, you click Download Transactions. A message then appears advising that it may take a little while to download the transactions. You click OK, and then a progress bar appears. Once complete, a further message appears and you click OK. The transactions that have been downloaded then appear in the top left box. Now, as far as matching is concerned, we've got 2 main options. We can highlight a bank transaction, select the equivalent Sage transaction, and then click Match to move them to the bottom box. However, doing this and matching the transactions manually isn't a great time saver over manually reconciling. So if we just highlight the transaction in the bottom box and then click on Match, it'll then move the transactions back to the top boxes. Now, the big benefit of using bank feeds is the auto match option. Now when we click auto match, it'll look at the first bank transaction and see if there's an equivalent transaction that you've already entered into Sage. If there is, it'll match it and move them into the bottom box. It'll then move on to the next one, look for a match. If it finds one, it'll move them to the bottom box. Now there's certain criteria for the transactions to be matched. So for instance, dates, each transaction must be within 4 days of each other. Obviously must be a payment or a receipt, they must correspond, and obviously the values must match as well. If it selects a bank transaction and then finds an equivalent transaction that meets that criteria, it can match it and move it to the bottom box, and that can be a big time saver. So we'll click auto match, and in this instance it's matched virtually all of the transactions that were downloaded from the bank. Now what we're left with is a transaction where it hasn't found an equivalent transaction that's been entered into Sage. Now it was just a case that we might have a list of transactions left in the top right hand corner, in which case we could go down and again manually match it if there is an equivalent transaction. But as there isn't, what we'll do is we'll highlight that bank feed transaction, and then on the right hand side we'll click Create. When we click Create, it'll give us a list of appropriate transactions. Now for bank fees or bank charges, we would normally just enter that as a bank payment within the software. As that's already selected, we'll just click OK. It's then just equivalent of filling in the blanks on the bank payment screen. So we know it's got the right bank account selected, so account 1200 in this example. It picks up the date automatically and the reference. If required, you can enter an extra reference. We're just going to leave it blank in this case. And then you need to enter an appropriate nominal code. So in this case 7901 for bank charges. We'll then just continue entering the rest of the information. So we'll leave the department set as whatever it defaults to, ignore the project reference and also the cost code, type in some details, so we'll just type charges in this case. Now as bank charges in the UK are classed as being exempt of VAT, so you would normally enter T2 for that one, we need to enter the full value of that bank charge into the net column. Change the tax code to T2 and the tax amount zeroes out. At that point, that's all of the transaction details entered, and we click Save. You then return to the bank feeds window. The transaction has been entered into Sage and the two transactions have been moved to the bottom boxes. At this stage, as all of the transactions have been matched, that's the bank feed complete and we could branch off to the reconciliation window at that point. However, before we do that, we're going to set up a rule in case any additional bank fees in the future download. And that will save us having to manually enter that transaction. To set up a rule, we first of all select the transaction that we want to set up a rule for. So in this case, the bank fee. And then we click Create Rule. Step 1 is to name your rule. In this case, we call it Bank Charges. We then need to select one or more of the conditions that are listed. Now we're going to keep ours nice and simple, and what we're going to instruct the software to do is basically next time it downloads this transactions is look for any transaction with the following reference. So we'll select the reference checkbox. We'll leave the condition set to equals, and also you'll see it automatically pulls through the reference from the transaction that we'd selected. So in this case, bank fee. Now that's the only thing we want to base this rule on. So we'll click Add. And then we're given an option to split the value of the transaction. So for instance, if we downloaded a transaction that maybe relates to, like say for instance we had a direct debit for gas and electric, we might split it 50-50 between two different nominal codes. But because it's just a single nominal code that we want to allocate this against, we'll just leave the percentage set to 100. You can see we can specify the transaction will be a customer transaction, a supplier transaction, or a nominal. We want to post this transaction to a nominal code, and you can see it's pulled through 7901 by default. It'll add a friendly narrative, so bank fee, and we'll just leave all the other details set as they are. And then at the bottom we'll just click Add. The final option is to indicate whether you want to review the transaction before posting. So in the future, if we were to download the transactions and the software was to recognize that bank fee, so therefore it knows what to do with it and it could then potentially post the bank payment for us, do we want to review that and say yes, we want you to do that, or do we want the software just to post it automatically? So if you want it to post automatically and not bother reviewing it, we'll take the tick out of the little checkbox and then we click Save Rule. A message then appears just to advise that the rule has been saved. You click OK, and that's the rule set up ready for when we download future transactions. Now we're just going to set the one rule up in this instance. So all of the transactions are matched that have been downloaded against the relevant transactions. We've created any missing transactions that we hadn't entered into Sage. So everything's allocated and matched and in the bottom box, and we can continue to the reconciliation screen at this point. To finish the bank feeds process, we click Confirm and Continue to Reconcile. This takes us across to the manual reconciliation window. So we start by completing the statement summary. We'll accept the majority of the defaults, however we will change the statement date, so the date that you're actually reconciling up to. You then click OK. The reconciliation window opens, and as you'll see, all of the transactions that were matched in the bank feeds window are already in the bottom matched transactions box. All we need to do at this stage is click Reconcile. Once the transactions have been flagged, you'll then be returned to the bank accounts window, and that's the bank feed and reconciliation process complete. That brings us to the end of this demo. We hope you found it useful. You'll find more information about setting up bank feeds and rules via our Help Centre, which you can access via the navigation bar within Sage 50.